Good morning. Mr Castleton.
Does Your Honour require appearances?
Yes, I will take appearances. I see Mr Free is here.
Your Honour, before I commence my closing address, I just want to set out for Your Honour's benefit and indeed for my learned friends the order of business today. I will firstly address Your Honour in relation to Your Honour's Stage 2 inquiry in relation to communications and warnings and fire prediction modelling. That will be followed by Your Honour's related Stage 1 hearing into the cause and origin of the Kangawalla Die Hard fire, then followed by the inquest into the deaths of Vivian Chaplin and George Knoll. My learned friend Mr Wilcox will address Your Honour on the Badger Forest fire and the Dua National Park fire in relation to cause and origin, followed by address in relation to the inquest into the deaths of Colin Burns, John Smith and Richard Steele.
Yes, thank you, Mr Castleton.
I'll commence firstly then, Your Honour, with Your Honour Stage.
Sorry, Mr Castleton. Mr Free.
Your Honour, please, I appear with my learned friend Ms Woodland for the state entities, primarily the RFS for today's purposes.
Thank you, Mr Free.
Thank you, Your Honour. In late 2019, the Kangawalla fire, Badger Forest fire and the Currawong State Forest fires tragically claimed the lives of 11 people. On 8 November 2019, the Kangawalla fire spread rapidly and unexpectedly into the town of Waitalaba. More than half of the homes in that community were destroyed, including the primary school, which burned to the ground. Tragically, George Knoll and Vivian Chaplin lost their lives. Almost 2 months later, on 30 and 31 December 2019, a day of severe fire danger, the Badger Forest fire spread far beyond what was anticipated and claimed the lives of Colin Burns, Ross Rickson, Patrick Sorway, Robert Sorway, Richard Steele and John Smith. And the Currawong State Forest fire saw the deaths of Lawrence Andrew, John Butler and Michael Campbell. Your Honour, the sheer spread of each fire, which did not always accord with RFS predictions, give rise to the issue of the adequacy of systems and methods of fire prediction used by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Further, the delay in warning the community of Waitalaba of the unexpected spread of the Kangawalla fire on 8 November 2019, before it was impacted, raises a concern about the adequacy of communications and emergency warning systems used by the RFS. The RFS takes issue with some of the recommendations that arise from the Kangawalla fire. They relate generally to issues of delay, the provision of Phoenix fire spread prediction maps to the incident management team, and ground truthing or verification of intelligence reports. Can I deal with the issue of delay first, Your Honour? An emergency alert was issued for Waitalaba 93 minutes after the incident management team were first made aware by an RFS brigade captain that the Kangawalla fire had broken containment lines and was, in the words of the captain, potentially threatening Waitalaba. The RFS submits that this is not a long period of time within which to receive incomplete information from various sources, absorb it, ascertain its relevance, make assessments as to its spread, assess the appropriate warning and issue that warning. In our respectful submission, that omits to recognise first that the threat to Waitalaba should have been evident after receipt of the initial call from Grant Donnelly, captain of the Board Knob Brigade. Second, even if it was not clear then, the picture of an escalating and imminent threat to Waitalaba ought to have been clear at least, in our respectful submission, 38 minutes after the initial call at 3:53 p.m, when the IMT were contacted by Kim Jermy, the captain of the Waitalaba Brigade. And third, that decision-making did not reflect the content of the reports from the ground, suggesting that their content was not fully relayed up the chain of command. Dealing now, Your Honour, with the initial report. At 3:15 p.m. on 8 November 2019, Grant Donnelly of the Board Knob RFS Brigade telephoned the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre. Mr Donnelly informed the IMT that the Kangawalla fire had broken out and was heading east, more than likely in the Man River Nature Reserve by now, and heading towards Old Grafton Road. Mr Donnelly went on to say, Waitalba might have to look at some strategies there off the old Grafton Road, but the wind's got to drop. It's potentially threatening Waitalba. And I'll just play now that portion of Mr Connolly's call to the fire.
Rural Fire Service.
Yeah, g'day, it's Grant Donnelly at Bald Knob. Just wondering if I talk to whoever's looking after the Kangawalla fire.
Kangawalla Fire. Okay.
Broken out again on us.
Okay.
I don't know whether words got through yet, but yeah, someone who's...
No, I haven't heard Kangawalla being mentioned yet.
Yeah,
I'm just writing down what you're saying, and
Yep.
I'll get on to whoever. So it's
Yep.
broken out.
Yeah, it's heading east.
Kangawalla.
It's more than likely in the Man River Nature Reserve by now.
Possibly in, what was the name?
Man River Nature Reserve.
Man River Nature Reserve.
And heading towards the old Grafton Road.
Heading to Old Grafton Road.
Yeah, now our brigade is there trying to block it from burning more of the open country, but that's all they can do at the moment.
Which brigade are you, Grant? Sorry?
Bald Knob?
Bald Knob.
Yep.
You're on scene, are you?
I'm not, but my
No, I meant
brigade.
Bald Knob. Yeah. Bald
Yeah.
Knob on scene, direct attacking.
No, not
open-
direct attacking. They're just working with a dozer, trying to limit it to the south of the. Trying to create a break to limit it to the south, basically push it into the nature reserve. That's all they can do.
With dozer in open area.
Yep.
To
Yeah.
the south.
Trying to
south.
put a break east-west along that. Yeah.
Putting in an east-west break.
Yep. I haven't got any more information, but I've got a couple of fellows going over there now, but that's all I know.
Thank you.
But a fair bit of smoke going up there. I don't know if you've got anyone there's probably no crews available anyway, but...
Who would I call if you needed somebody?
Well, I think we might have to, Waitalba might have to look at some strategies there off the old Grafton Road, but the wind's got to drop. I mean, it's potentially threatening Waitalba, so...
Okay.
Yep.
So in the future, possibly the community, you mean? Yep.
Yeah, down there on the river.
Okay. Yep. Okay. All right, I'll
I don't
get
know
on to it.
who you've got there, but you should be able to get me on the mobile. Someone was just trying to ring me then. It might be someone there, but...
Could I have...
I'll just have also displayed a satellite image with markers for Old Grafton Road and the boundaries of the Man River Nature Reserve. Your Honour will recall that Old Grafton Road runs through Waitalba and the Man River Nature Reserve is to the west of Waitalba. Hopefully that'll come up shortly. Whether we're able to magnify it. Thank you. Your Honour, the prevailing weather conditions were known to the RFS. Deputy Commissioner McKechnie accepted in evidence that where it is known that there are northwesterly winds gusting in excess of 40 kilometres an hour, it would not be difficult to work out that the fire was going to head in a southeasterly direction at some speed. It is unclear precisely what was occurring within the IMT immediately after Mr Donnelly's call. No contact was made by the IMT with the Waitalba Brigade to ascertain the situation on the ground. Either firstly, after Mr Donnelly identified that Waitalba was potentially under threat, or secondly, after a member of the public identified a fire halfway up Tommy's Rock. Mr Jeremy gave evidence that Tommy's Rock is 1.5 kilometres west of Waitalba. And Your Honour sees there the proximity of Waitalba to Tommy's Rock with the blue pin. contact was instead initiated by the Waitalba Brigade itself in a call from Mr Jeremy at 3:53 p.m. The fire behaviour analyst tasked with carrying out a rapid prediction for the fire, Mr Gibb, and a person within the IMT at the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre providing information to him, Mr Felt, gave evidence that none of the information being received from the fire ground in that first hour was conveyed to them, being the very people tasked with ascertaining the likely spread of the fire. Despite the report from an experienced captain of an RFS brigade of a potential threat to a remote community, the public liaison officer and incident controller were not made aware that the fire had broken containment until 3:50 p.m. and 4:11 p.m. respectively. To the extent that there was an intelligence verification process that accounts for part of the 93 minutes, what that was is not accounted for in the evidence of those within the IMT, nor the contemporaneous logs and recordings. The RFS's presumption in their written submissions in reply, paragraph 27, subparagraph B, based on the call with Mr Jeremy, that important information was being escalated within the IMT at an early stage is not borne out by the evidence in our respectful submission. As will be heard shortly in the call from Mr Jeremy, Elaine, within the IMT, passed the phone to Scott because he knew the area better than her, not, in our respectful submission, as the RFS asserts, presumably because of the importance of the information. I come now to Mr Jeremy's call. Even if the threat to Waitalba was not evident to the RFS after the call from Grant Donnelly, it certainly should have been by 3:53 p.m. By that time, Your Honour, the IMT had been informed, first, by an experienced RFS Captain Grant Donnelly that Waitalba would potentially be under threat. Secondly, in a report from a member of the public at 3:39 p.m. that the fire was halfway up to Tommy's Rock Lookout, and I'll just play that call now, Your Honour.
Good afternoon, RFS Melbourne Taylor. Belinda speaking. How may I help you?
Yes, hi. A new fire on Tommy's Rock Trail, which comes off the main road there, Grafton Road. Apparently, it's halfway up to Tommy's Rock Lookout. It's in the Man River Nature Reserve.
All right.
It's a new fire. He said it started from an ember from a nearby fire. You've got a nearby fire which has an incident number of 196656.
56. Yeah.
But this is a separate fire. Sorry.
Yeah. What's this on incident number?
The incident number?
Yeah.
197319.
Is there a callback number on that one at all?
Is from a landline, so you might not get him, but it was from 67335376.
All right. And what road is it off?
It's on Tommy's Rock Trail, which comes off the old Grafton Road, and it's halfway up to the lookout, Tommy's Rock Lookout.
Okay. All right, no problem. I will put that through now.
Okay then, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
And finally, Your Honour, by another experienced RFS captain, Mr Jeremy, and a fellow RFS member, 14 minutes later, that the fire was below Tommy's Rock, spotting in front of itself by 500 metres every couple of minutes, and expected to be in Waitalba within the hour. And I'll play that call from Mr Jeremy now, Your Honour.
Elaine speaking.
Hello, Elaine, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Kim Jeremy from Waitalba. We've got a big problem down here. We've got a fire below Tommy's Rock in the West End paddocks heading for Waitalba. We need all the help we can get.
Yep. Okay.
We're rounding up
now,
crews now to go and have a look at it and start assessing it. But it's there's a fire line from the river up towards Tommy's Rock.
Yeah, would that be the Kangaroo fire? Because we did
No,
get
no,
reports that
it's not the Kangaroo fire. This is like only a kilometre from Waitala.
It's only a kilometre from my
Yeah, maybe 3. I've just got like one of my crew leaders here has just gone up and had a look at it.
Would that be the Man River Nature Reserve?
Yeah, and the Man River Nature Reserve.
Okay, so I've had intel that the Kangaroo has possibly lost the Man River Nature Reserve heading into the old Grafton Road, Bald Knob are on scene. And
yeah, no, this is down in the valley, like on the Tommy's Rock actual, you know, where there's a fire trail on Tommy's Rock in the nature reserve. It's on the south side of the river heading towards us.
Tommy's Rock, south side of the river.
Yeah.
This is Waitala?
Yeah, this is Ken Jeremy from Waitala, yep.
You know what
sorry, I'm just speaking to Scott.
Yep.
on the Mount Mitchell camping reserve.
Actually, I might put him on because he knows the area a little bit better than me. Hang on a sec.
Yep, no worries, thank you.
Thank you.
Scott speaking. Hey Scott, we've got a fire coming along the side of the river from Tommy's Rock down to the river. It's about 3 k's upriver from us now. Yep. Yeah. So we're getting whatever crews we can get together now. We're all meeting at the shed. And
well, so do you think that it's, I'm just moving my map around here, so is that coming from the Kangaroo?
No,
right,
it's much, much closer.
Righto.
It's broken. It looks like it's, hey Scott, it's Gray here, Andrew.
Go mate.
Yeah, I just went to the oval next to the school, and it looks like it has spotted from Kangaroo, but it's come down river.
Yeah, righto. Okay, make
And you know where the camping you know where the camping reserve is down here?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. You know exactly where that is on the tile? The camping man with the camping.
Yeah.
Camping ground. Well, it's on the southern side of the river there, about 1.5 k's up the hill. I can see the flames, and it's spotting in front of itself by about 500 metres every couple minutes.
Yeah, righto. No worries.
It's going to hit the western road of Waitalaba within the hour or two. So we need some more asset protection if we could do that, please.
Yeah, mate. I've paged 9 brigades at the moment, so we'll try. We've got air support on its way as well.
Okay, so it's below the Tommy's Rock lookout, but it's already to the east of that.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
Right.
Is that enough information?
Yeah, it is, mate. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Scott.
All right. Thank you.
All right, mate. Thanks.
Your Honour, that information was consistent with a rapid progression towards Waitalaba in just over half an hour. Significant parts of it were provided by 2 experienced local RFS brigade captains. The increasing urgency of the situation in our respectful submission was reflected in the voice of Mr Jeremy's colleague, Andre Cook. Even then, and despite Mr Cook identifying an impact within the hour, the incident controller was not informed for another 18 minutes after Mr Jeremy's call, and it took 55 minutes to issue an emergency alert. Coming now to decision making, when it was determined that an emergency alert should be issued at 4:25 p.m, there was still a discrepancy between what appears to have been within the knowledge of those making decisions within the IMT and State Command and what was occurring on the ground. During the red phone call, it was determined to keep the warning level at Watch and Act, specifically Watch and Act 3 or WA3, and B, the situation report issued 3 minutes later assessed the time for impact of the fire front to be 2 to 6 hours. The RFS's alert level guidance matrix indicates that a WA3 level will be adopted on days of severe fire danger where the time to impact is 2 to 6 hours. A time to impact of less than 2 hours in those conditions warranted an emergency warning EW5 rating. At the time the RFS had been informed at 3:53 p.m. in the call from Mr Jeremy that the fire was 3 kilometres from the town and spotting ahead of itself by 500 metres every couple of minutes, and at 4:15 p.m. from Grant Donnelly, in which he gave a situation update from the fireground and stated, "You'll probably need to evacuate Waitalaba." Incident Controller Mark Williams was not aware of the call from Grant Donnelly, nor was he informed of the extreme spotting reported in the call from Mr Jermy. Both Deputy Commissioner McKechnie and Incident Controller Mark Williams accepted, with the benefit of hindsight, had they been appraised of that information, then it would have been appropriate to adopt an alert level of emergency warning, that is EW5. Not only was there delay, but it is evident that the flow of information within the INT was suboptimal. That fed into the provisions of inaccurate information to the public. I'll now touch upon the impact of the delay. In their written submissions in reply, the RFS appears to place emphasis on the evidence of Mr Jermy and Mr Hine to suggest that an earlier alert would not have made much of a difference. Mr Hine attested in a statement that at about 2:50 p.m. he heard on a UHF radio that Waitalaba RFS telling everyone to get out. Mr Hine's account at the time of that radio message, firstly, was not tested in cross-examination, and secondly, is inconsistent with the evidence of the captain of the Whitetail Brigade, Mr Jermy, that he made the decision to evacuate when he arrived at the fire shed at about 4 p.m. So far as there is evidence that the local brigade communicated with the community on the day about the risk, the court received evidence of residents who were not made aware of the potential for impact. Alan Bacon gave evidence in the inquest into the death of George Knoll that on 8 November 2019, and I quote, "When I woke up that morning, I heard that it was just a watch and act kind of situation. The RFS was pretty well just standing back, not really doing much. It wasn't that much of a threat to any assets or anyone as far as I know. It wasn't. There was no state of emergency or emergency phone calls or contacts from anyone. Everyone was pretty sedated with the whole situation. No one. It's just what's been happening for the last 4 or 5 weeks." Matthew Smith gave evidence that, and I quote, "No one told me that the fire had progressed. I dropped off the Bobcat and then I drove my truck back to drop it off at that front of the property where my ute was sitting because I was planning on jumping in my ute to go home. And when I jumped out of my ute and went up to let people know that I was leaving my truck there, I noticed that there was smoke intensely, like I could smell it, stronger, and it was visible coming over the hill. And I yelled out to the people inside the house to come out and have a look at what was going on. And within 30 seconds, a minute, there was ember attack raining down and everyone just started going where they had to go. In our respectful submission, Your Honour, it simply cannot be asserted that an early alert would have made no difference, nor that the communication at a local level completely made up for the delay in issuing the alert. The RFS also assert in their submissions that there is no evidence of delays in inputting information into ICON as causing any delay. There is evidence, however, to conclude that it made the work of fire behaviour analyst David Gibb more difficult. Whilst Mr Gibb was carrying out his prediction in the afternoon of 8 November 2019, the RFS received multiple reports about the fire, including the 3 calls just played earlier. None of that information was conveyed to Mr Gibb, nor to Mr Philp, who would then have provided it to Mr Gibb, nor was it uploaded promptly to ICON. Mr Gibb only had the benefit of a report of Grant Donnelly's first call when it was uploaded to ICON at 4:13 p.m. Mr Gibb's evidence was that the information would have been useful when carrying out his prediction. It was information that he agreed he should have been given. Turning now, if I may, Your Honour, to the Phoenix fire spread prediction maps. All of this may have been avoided had the fire behaviour analysts within the INT been given a copy of a Phoenix breakout prediction carried out on 6 November 2019 that showed a potential impact on Waitalaba on 8 November in 10 to 15 scenarios. The RFS contend that the submission that the non-provision of a prediction was a failure should be rejected, as it was inconsistent with the RFS's practice not to release that information and against the weight of evidence. Respectfully, Your Honour, that submission does not fully engage with, first, the reason for the practice of not providing fire spread prediction maps to IMTs, and secondly, the evidence from those within the IMT. Dr. Heemstra's evidence was that given the limitations of Phoenix breakout predictions, they are best used for contingency planning to understand risk. Had the prediction been provided to those with expert knowledge within the IMT, being the people involved in setting prediction priorities, then it could have been used as suggested by Dr. Heemstra. The evidence of Dr. Philp, a very experienced RFS fire behaviour analyst within the IMT, on 8 November 2019 was that, and I quote, had that prediction of 6 November been available, that would have been an incentive, at least for me, to bring Kangaroo up on my radar and at least have done some very approximate assessment of what it could do and make sure that the public liaison officer was aware of those concerns. This is significant, Your Honour, as the evidence of Angela Burford, the public liaison officer within the Glen Innes IMT on 8 November 2019 was that, and I quote, there was no warning that the fire was going to impact Waitalaba before it did on 8 November 2019. Had it been predicted that the fire had the potential to impact Waitalaba on 8 November 2019, I would have undertaken pre-planning for Waitalaba as part of the public liaison plan, organised for community newsletters to be issued and for door knocking to occur. Due to the speed with which the fire impacted Waitalaba, the only option available for community messaging was to issue an emergency alert. Ultimately, Your Honour, State Command had information that it did not share with experts within the IMT who had the ability and training to use the predictions in the very way that the RFS intended for them to be used. Whether the non-provision of the report is classified as a failure or not, in our respectful submission, is immaterial. Had the prediction been provided to the fire behaviour analyst within the IMT, then the fire behaviour analyst may have alerted Ms Burford and steps may have been taken to provide advance warning to the residents of Waitalaba, which is a remote rural community off the grid. Can I just now, Your Honour, deal briefly with recommendations? Of the proposed recommendations set out in our written submission, 3 are contentious. Recommendations 1 and 4, Your Honour, are no longer pressed, having regard to the written submissions made by the RFS. Instead, it is submitted that it would be appropriate to make a recommendation in relation to training of officers in respect of intelligence verification or ground truthing, and secondly, a revised recommendation in respect of the training of public liaison officers to better ensure incident controllers are sufficiently briefed such that communication issues are considered in setting priorities for fire prediction. Dealing firstly with ground truthing, Your Honour will recall Angela Burford, the public liaison officer within the Glen Innes IMT on 8 November 2019, gave evidence that she first became aware that the fire had broken out at 3:50 p.m. and then sought to ground truth, that is verify, that information. As identified by the RFS, this is intelligence verification. The RFS deliberately has no policy in relation to that verification as it relies on the professional judgment of its members in dynamic and ever-changing environment to make common sense assessments of intelligence reports. So far as a process was engaged in immediately after the call from Mr Donnelly, it appears that appropriate steps to verify risk may not have been taken. The absence of a telephone call to the Waitalaba Brigade to obtain information is unexplained. In those circumstances, Your Honour, and given the events of 8 November 2019, it is our submission that a review of RFS's training is warranted with a view to better equipping its officers to use their professional judgment to determine whether intelligence verification is required and the steps that ought to be taken to verify intelligence and, if necessary, in a timely manner. A proposed recommendation to that effect is contained at recommendation 10, which reads, and I quote, the RFS review its training for positions within an incident management team to ascertain whether there is scope for improvement to better equip staff to determine, firstly, whether intelligence needs to be verified, and secondly, the appropriate steps to be taken to obtain that verification. Can I now turn to the issue of consideration of communication difficulties in setting prediction priorities? Fire prediction takes on a greater significance where there is a potential risk to remote communities like Waitalaba, which experience communication difficulties. Newsletters, door knocking and the use of local brigades to contact people directly or take time to prepare and carry out. They could require 24 hours. Deputy Commissioner Peter McKechnie gave evidence that the longer the time frame the RFS has, then the more strategies it can put in place to notify the public. Ultimately, that time or advance warning is provided through fire prediction. Despite this, when David Philp, in consultation with the incident controller, prepared a list of prediction priorities on 8 November 2019, he did not take into account any likely difficulties in communicating warnings to communities if a fire, such as Kangawalla, broke containment. It was beyond the scope of his role and knowledge as a fire behaviour analyst. The events of 8 November 2019 point to a need to ensure that such communications issues are considered in determining prediction priorities within an IMT. The Public Liaison Officer is responsible, Your Honour, for obtaining information about communication challenges faced by communities. The Public Liaison Officer briefs the Incident Controller, who then sets prediction priorities in consultation with the Fire Behaviour Analyst within the IMT. Rather than disturbing the chain of command by requiring consultation with the Public Liaison Officer on priorities for prediction, it is submitted that the RFS should update their training for Public Liaison Officers to ensure that the Incident Controller is sufficiently briefed on communication challenges and the likely time needed to warn communities. This may better ensure that those considerations will be the subject of informed decision-making in setting priorities for fire predictions. As a result, the revised proposed recommendation number 2 in our submission should read as follows. The RFS develop training for public liaison officers and incident controllers that addresses the significance of early warning to communities with limited access to reliable communication systems. Can I just touch upon some changes to the remaining recommendations? In relation to the remaining recommendations and taking on board the submissions of the RFS, I propose the following, Your Honour, that recommendation 6 should refer to Athena instead of Spark, that the word senior should be deleted from proposed recommendation 7 subparagraph C, and that recommendation 9 should read as follows. The RFS continue to work with the Bureau of Meteorology towards A, developing fire atmosphere coupled modelling, and B, obtaining a better understanding of the interrelationship between atmospheric instability and bushfire, including to develop ensemble forecasting capabilities to be integrated into training of fire behaviour analysts and the development or refinement of models for fire prediction. Finally, Your Honour, can I say this, that those assisting the court express our sincere gratitude to those who have aided and provided information to Your Honour to assist with the general inquiries into fire prediction and communities and emergency warnings, and that we would like to publicly express our sincere condolences to the family, friends and communities of Lawrence Andrew, Colin Burns, John Butler, Michael Campbell, Vivian Chaplin, George Noel, Ross Rickson, Patrick Sorway, Robert Sorway, John Smith and Richard Steele. Your Honour, that concludes my closing address in relation to that stage 2 hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Castleton.
Thank you, Your Honour. There's nothing I wish to add.
Thanks very much.
I'm indebted to my learned friend. Your Honour, can I now move to Your Honour's inquiry into the cause and origin of the Kangawalla Die Hard fire. And I apologise, there may be some minor duplication. Your Honour, these are the closing submissions for the Coronial inquiry into the cause and origin of the fire known as the Kangawalla Die Hard fire. The inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30 subsection 1 of the Coroners Act and is accordingly limited to determining the cause and origin of the fire. The Kangawalla fire started in late October 2019. It burned in the Glen Innes local government area in the Northern Tablelands, encompassed with the lands of the Ngurrambul people. The devastation unleashed by the Kangawalla fire, particularly on 8 November 2019, was undoubtedly catastrophic. At a time when the fire was considered under control, the fire broke containment lines and quickly tore through the remote and tight-knit community of Waitalaba. The fire engulfed homes, destroyed the local school and fire shed, and tragically claimed the lives of George Knoll and Vivian Chaplin. The Kangawalla fire consumed an area of approximately 21,143 hectares, comprising 13,000 hectares of state forest and national park and almost 9,000 hectares of private property. At least 72 homes and 67 outbuildings were destroyed and at least a further 17 homes were damaged. The Kangawalla fire was one of many fires burning across the state of New South Wales during the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires, as Your Honour knows, were reported to Your Honour. Not all fires reported to Your Honour proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin continue to further consideration by a general inquiry as part of a stage 2 proceeding. The Kangawalla fire was the subject of a general inquiry into the New South Wales Rural Fire Service communications and warnings and a further general inquiry into the RFS fire prediction modelling. Both focus on the events surrounding the fire's impact on Waitalaba. These submissions are limited to the cause and origin of the Kangawalla fire. I'll briefly set out now, Your Honour, a chronology of events. On 26 October 2019, it is believed that lightning struck a tree within the Kangawalla Reserve, which lies within the area of Shannon Vale, east of Glen Innes and west of the Man River Nature Reserve. The Kangawalla Reserve is a remote area comprising of heavily wooded bushland. Its terrain is rugged with a mix of slowly undulating to very hilly parts and steeper gullies and gorges. On the afternoon of 26 October 2019, Dylan McKean, who lives at 464 Cooper Road, Red Range, witnessed a storm pass through the valley near his property in the direction of the Man River, approximately 1.5 kilometres away. Mr McKean described hearing a large crack of lightning, believing it was close. He could hear the sound of a sizzle following the crack. Just before 10 a.m. on 27 October, Mr McKean observed a plume of smoke on the northern side of the Man River. He took a photograph of what he saw and sent it to the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre at about 10:07 a.m. that day. And Your Honour sees that plume of smoke in the distance. He then telephoned the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre and asked whether he should call 000. He was advised that Glen Innes Fire Control Centre would notify 000. Mr McKean provided a map and coordinates of what he believed to be the general location of the fire. At 10:37 a.m, the Kangawalla fire was authorised as going by the RFS. By that point in time, a Section 44 declaration had already been made in response to the Bees Nest fire located within the Guy Fawkes National Park and was amended to include the Glen Innes local government area. At 11:30 a.m, the Shannon Vale Brigade telephoned Peter Alexander, resident of Skelton Creek Road, Shannon Vale, and member of the Shannon Vale RFS, to inform him that a fire had been detected at his property. Mr Alexander states that the RFS crews arrived at his property and he accompanied them to the southwest corner where they located the fire. At that time, the Kangawalla fire was burning in an area of about 2 hectares with smoke plumes about 500 metres high. At about 1:45 p.m. that same day, Mr McKean noted that what he first saw as a small plume of smoke had developed into a larger fire. It had progressed significantly in an easterly direction across the hill. Mr McKean took a further photograph, which Your Honour now sees on screen, at that time and sent it to the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre. At 3:12 p.m, Mr McKean took another photograph, which I'll have displayed shortly, Your Honour, which displayed the progression of the Kangawalla fire. According to Mr McKean, by this time, the fire had crossed the ridge, and Your Honour sees that now on the screen. From 30 October 2019, the Kangawalla fire continued to burn, but its progression slowed significantly. Between the 2nd and the 7th of November, the fire was contained. It was mapped as only progressing short distances or not at all. As Your Honour knows, that changed on the 8th of November 2019. The weather conditions deteriorated quickly and dramatically. On this day, the maximum temperatures in Glen Innes reached 27 degrees. A west-norwesterly wind was recorded with gusts of 52 kilometres per hour. At 10 a.m, the RFS recorded that there was no reports of smoke, and it was predicted that there was a low chance of the fire impacting on property. As Your Honour has just heard, at 3:15 p.m, Grant Donnelly of the Borden RFS Brigade telephoned the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre. Mr Donnelly informed the incident management team that the Kangawalla fire had broken out, heading east, more than likely in the Man River Nature Reserve by now, and heading towards Old Grafton Road. As Your Honour heard earlier, Mr Donnelly went on to say White might have to look at some strategies there off the Old Grafton Road, but the wind's got to drop. It's potentially threatening White. Within the next 1 hour and 21 minutes, the fire spread rapidly. By one report, it was spotting in front of itself by 500 metres every couple of minutes. At 4:36 p.m, Brett Miller, Deputy Captain of the White Brigade, radioed the IMT at Glen Innes and said the following, and I quote, Firecom, emergency, White 7. We have a fire impacting the whole of the west end of White. It's an extremely dangerous situation. We are pulling as many people out as we can. As Your Honour knows, an emergency alert was issued from around 4:48 p.m. for the Kangawalla area, with SMS messages sent to 357 services, of which 67 were not delivered, and voice messages made to 17 services, of which 7 were not answered. The next hour saw complete devastation for the White community. The Kangawalla fire continued to engulf homes, with fire crews access impeded by fallen trees, inaccessible roads and the fire itself. It was during this hour when, tragically, the properties of Miss Chaplin and Mr Noel were severely impacted by the fire, claiming their lives. I'll just have now displayed, Your Honour, a series of maps which shows the fire's progression, firstly on the 27th of October and then for the period 7 to 8 November. And Your Honour will see also the location of Vivian's and George's respective residences. See to the north George Noel's property and to the south Vivian Chaplin's. By 7:04 p.m. on the 8th of November, the Kangawalla fire had started spotting about 6 kilometres ahead of itself to Henry River and Newton Boyd. RFS situation reports indicate that at 8 p.m, New South Wales ambulances were being escorted into White, noting that there had been damage to the bridge that provided access to the township. The fire in White was still active at that time, and it posed a continuing threat to the community and to rural properties east of the town. At this stage, Your Honour, the Glen Innes Council had arranged for bulk water to be provided to assist in supporting operations. The Kangawalla fire continued to spread the following day, that is the 9th of November. The northern flank of the fire progressed to the north and northwest a distance of approximately 2.6 kilometres. The eastern flank of the Kangawalla fire progressed 1 to 2 kilometres east to southeast and merged with a number of previously separate spot fires, and other parts of the fire spread less than a kilometre in various directions. On the 9th of November, the Glen Innes Council attended to install crossings where the bridge had been damaged the day before. It was estimated at this time that over 40 properties had been lost in Waitalaba. The Guida Highway was closed between Guida and Grafton, with fire impacting the Old Grafton Road in multiple locations. On 11 November, the status of the Kangawalla fire was finally downgraded to controlled. Crews continued to actively patrol and black out along containment lines, including the Guida Highway, east of the Glen Innes Correctional Centre, to contain the fire south of the highway. Access to Waitalaba was still closed due to the danger posed by trees along access roads. For the next week, the Kangawalla fire continued to grow, but only at a short distance. It spotted in difficult to access country and remote area firefighting teams were deployed. Fire crews prioritised consolidating containment lines, backburning and active patrols. On 24 November 2019, the Kangawalla fire was declared out, and Your Honour will see now the reach of that fire from when it commenced in late October 2019. And I just deal very briefly, Your Honour, with key conclusions as to the cause and origin of the Kangawalla fire. Your Honour has had the benefit of expert evidence from, firstly, Senior Constable Andrew Cheetham, a forensic investigator with experience in fire and wildlife investigation, and secondly, Mr Danny Bush, RFS fire investigator. In parallel investigations, both concluded that the most likely cause of the fire was lightning strikes on the afternoon of 26 October 2019. Mr Bush first attended the suspected area of origin on 10 November with Senior Constable Cheetham. They carried out an aerial-based inspection informed by a photograph taken by Mr McKean from his property. Mr Bush was looking for a run of the fire, and once identified, a ground-based investigation was then performed. Mr Bush gave evidence that he could not identify multiple ignitions during his site visit, canvassing or through the gathering of empirical data. He could only ascertain one particular point of origin in relation to the Kangawalla fire. That location, Your Honour, was south of Skeleton Creek Road and north of the Man River. In his aerial inspection of the site, Mr Bush observed a general vector run which was west to east in a large U-pattern. During his ground investigation, he was able to track back further to the west to what Mr Bush believed to be the area or point of origin. Mr Bush confirmed that it was not particularly difficult to identify macro or micro fire indicators. He saw significant macro indicators of angular char on large eucalyptus sclerophyll trees. Taking heed of those indicators, he traced them to the west towards Shannon Vale. Mr Bush described the terrain as angulating to very steep. It was a heavily forested area with sclerophyll trees. On 11 November, Mr Alexander's property was canvassed, and Mr Alexander provided information in relation to what he felt was the origin of the fire. Mr Bush said they then drove to a certain extent and then had to walk on foot into the general area they believed could have been the potential origin based on the macro indicators and Mr Alexander's canvassing. They started in a semi-serpentine direction, trying to follow indicators or macro indicators going from east back towards the west. As a result of this ground-based investigation, Mr Bush identified a specific point which he believed may have been where the fire ignited, and a tree that had been clearly affected by a lightning strike. Mr Bush told Your Honour that it was Senior Constable Cheetham who had initially observed the tree, and Your Honour will see now some photographs of the relevant tree in question. Based on the macro and micro indicators, visual observations of the lightning-struck tree, empirical data sets including lightning data, and canvassing of local residents, including Mr McKean and Mr Alexander, Mr Bush's working hypothesis was that the lightning-struck tree they identified was the likely cause of the Kangawalla fire. When put to him Mr Bush agreed that the evidence suggests there was lightning strike activity in the afternoon of 26 October and that Kangawalla fire was first sighted and reported to the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre on 27 October 2019. Mr Bush excluded, importantly, all other potential causes of the Kangawalla fire, largely due to the location of where he believed to be the point of origin, being remote and inaccessible and away from human activity. In his oral evidence, Detective Senior Constable Cheetham confirmed that he reached the same conclusion as Mr Bush. The most likely cause of the Kangawalla fire was lightning strike, in his opinion. Detective Senior Constable Cheetham described in evidence the macro or micro indicators that he tracked that led him to that specific point of origin. He said they tend to use grass, indicators like foliage freeze, and then micro indicators like cupping and how ash flies into the face of trees in the direction the wind is travelling. There was no degradation of the fire scene that made it difficult to track the fire by the time the investigation took place, particularly because of the remote and isolated location. From tracking the fire indicators, Detective Senior Constable Cheetham identified a tree with a significant lightning scar. The scar ran from quite high in the tree and spiralled down the bark of the tree all the way to the ground. He ultimately recorded the coordinates of the lightning-struck tree as latitude 29.70345 and longitude 151.94001. And Your Honour sees on the screen now that relevant location marked by a red pin. In relation to excluding other causes for the Kangawalla fire, Detective Senior Constable Cheetham told the court there were no other obvious indicators. It was an isolated area where there was no human activity. The likely cause was the lightning-struck tree. In court, Senior Constable Cheetham gave evidence in relation to his statement and a view that he expressed, namely, that there was more than one point of ignition. Concerning this evidence, the RFS clarified in their written submissions that the RFS fire progression mapping for the early stages of the Kangawalla fire did not show two areas of fire. Rather, a second shaded area was in fact a movable RFS icon known as an incident point, the purpose of which is to identify the location of where the incident management team initially believed the fire location to be, together with its assumed fire spread. It does not represent either a point of origin of the Kangawalla fire or a second ignition. Finally, Your Honour, in our fire lightning strike to a tree on or around 26 October 2019, and the origin of the fire was in bushland in Shannon Vale, in an area north of the Man River and south of Skeleton Creek Road at coordinates latitude 29.70345 and longitude 151.94001. As I've said previously, Your Honour, those assisting the court again express their gratitude to those who have aided and provided information to Your Honour to assist with the coronial inquiry into the cause and origin of the Kangawalla fire. That concludes the closing address in relation to the cause and origin of the Kangawalla fire. Can I now deal with the related inquests into the death of Vivian Chaplin and then George Noel? Starting firstly with Your Honour's inquest into the death of Vivian Chaplin. Now, these are the closing submissions for the inquest into the into the death of Vivian Chaplin. As Your Honour recalls, Ms Chaplin was 69 years old when she died at 10:35 a.m. on 9 December 2019 at the Concord Repatriation General Hospital here in Sydney. We take this opportunity to acknowledge these devastating circumstances and the tremendous loss to her family, friends and fellow neighbours and residents of Waitalaba. In particular, Your Honour, we acknowledge Vivian's immediate family, her sons Aaron and Reuben and their father Dennis, who I understand may be watching these proceedings. As Your Honour has heard this morning, on 8 November 2019, the Kangawalla fire, which had previously been contained, swept through the remote community of Waitalaba with little notice. Miss Chaplin was alone when the fire reached her home. She was discovered by a family friend, unconscious at the back of her property, and was airlifted to Concord Hospital for treatment. She tragically died the following morning. Miss Chaplin's home in Waitalaba was surrounded by dense bushland and sat behind the Brothers State Forest. The property was 1,500 acres comprising farmland, uncleared scrubland and a dwelling made of colour-bond steel. Miss Chaplin lived in that dwelling with her son Aaron. Aaron's father Dennis lived in a separate dwelling on the property. In the 12 months prior to the Kangaroo fire, Vivian underwent hip replacement surgery and occasionally required the support of a cane. She was otherwise mobile and self-sufficient. At about midday on the 8th of November, Aaron and Dennis departed the property to attend to Aaron's and to visit Aaron's wife, Crystal, who lived in Glen Innes. Vivian remained at the property. Shortly after 3:30pm, Aaron's friend Matthew Smith attended Vivian's property to access his machinery, which he kept on the property. While there, he noticed Vivian walking past one of the sheds. He called out hello and she waved back. Matthew had also noticed two vehicles on the property, Vivian's white SUV and Aaron's white Hilux. He left soon after. As he approached the front gate of Waitalaba, he noticed embers and sensed smoke. He went to alert other residents of the fire and then headed to one of the evacuation points in Waitalaba. At about 4pm, Matthew's partner, Tara, alerted Aaron that Matthew had been trying to reach him about the approaching fire. Aaron and Dennis immediately headed towards the property in their truck. Crystal informed Reuben, Vivian's other son, of the fire threat, and Reuben called 000 for assistance. At around 5pm, Crystal received a call from Vivian. Vivian told her that the property was on fire and she needed the boys, that is Aaron and Dennis, there now. Crystal confirmed that the boys were on their way and then the phone went dead. This was the last known contact with Vivian. Aaron drove down Old Grafton Road towards Waitalaba. According to Aaron, the road was completely consumed by fire and there was nobody around, no fire truck or locals. We pulled back and watched the fire for a moment. We decided there was no chance we could get through the road. Following that assessment, Aaron and Dennis travelled back to Glen Innes, arriving there around 5:30pm. Aaron called his friend Matthew Smith to tell him that his mother was unaccounted for and asked Matthew to try and find her. Sometime in the late afternoon or early evening, RFS volunteer firefighters Michael Borgasia and Jesse Kirkman attended Vivian's property and observed the property was on fire. They were not tasked with searching for Vivian and did not know she was missing nor whether she was at the property at that time. They attended out of general concern and undertook a search around the property. Michael and Jesse told the court that when they attended Vivian's property, they did not see any vehicles. Mr. Borgasia recalls thinking, "There's no car here. I don't think she's here." Jesse extended a hose down to the back of the house in an attempt to extinguish the fire, and Michael turned on the water from their truck. The house at that time was fully engulfed by fire. Michael looked inside the house and called out but received no response. Michael did not look around the carport or the shed. Shortly after, Michael observed that a gas bottle located at the back of the house was shooting flames. He decided that it was best to leave the property. Neither reported seeing or hearing Vivian while there. They remained on the property for a short time, estimated to be around 15 minutes. Jesse and Michael regrouped at the community centre. While there, Jesse spoke to Matthew Smith, who expressed concerns about Vivian. Jesse reassured him that they had attended Vivian's property and that she was not there and likely to have gone to a neighbour's house. At some point following that conversation, Matthew Smith headed towards Vivian's property. En route, Matthew picked up two other residents and then encountered an RFS Hilux driving towards him. Matthew flashed his headlights at the vehicle and spoke to the driver about his intention to locate Vivian. The driver of the Hilux said in response, "You can't, it's not safe," and we didn't find anyone there. Showing incredible courage, Matthew proceeded. He located Vivian unconscious near the shed at the back of the property. He took urgent steps to retrieve her, transporting her towards the Waitalaba Bridge and then obtained critical medical treatment for her. At 5:54pm, a New South Wales ambulance was called for Vivian. By 5:59pm, that first unit was en route and arrived in just under an hour. Vivian was treated by paramedics and taken to a designated landing site, that is the Waitalba School Oval, for transportation by air to Concord Hospital here in Sydney. On arrival at the Oval, Vivian went into cardiac arrest and cardiopulmonary resuscitation was commenced and she was intubated. At around 9:30pm, air retrieval took over Vivian's treatment and she was airlifted to hospital. At 3:27am on 9 October 2019, Vivian arrived at the emergency department of Concord Hospital. Soon after admission, Vivian again entered cardiac arrest and was resuscitated. In the early hours of that morning, she was transferred to the intensive care unit. At 10:35am on the 9th of October 2019, Vivian was pronounced deceased. Your Honour has received into evidence a volume of material which includes statements from members of Vivian's family, members of the New South Wales Police Force, RFS, as well as civilian witnesses. It also includes medical records, RFS statements and operational documents, and an expert report from an intensivist. Your Honour also heard evidence during the inquest, which Your Honour conducted on the 8th of March 2022, evidence from Michael Borgasia and Jesse Kirkman, the two RFS firefighters who attended Vivian's property, and of course Matthew Smith, who located Vivian. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner holding an inquest concerning the death of a person is required to make findings as to the identity of the person who died, when and where they died, and the manner and cause of death. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to matters which have the capacity to improve public health and safety in the future arising out of the death in question. In this inquest, Vivian's identity is known, as is the date and place of her death. For this reason, the inquest into Vivian's death focused on the manner and cause of her death. Professor Ian Seppelt, intensive care expert at the Department of Intensive Care Medicine at Nepean Hospital, was engaged to review extracts of Vivian's medical records from her treatment at the Concord Hospital, the New South Wales ambulance records and autopsy report, with a view to providing a retrospective assessment as to whether Vivian would have been in a clinically irreversible condition after she sustained her injuries, or whether there was a realistic prospect of survival if medical treatment by New South Wales ambulance had been provided sooner. He was satisfied that Vivian's burn injury was unsurvivable, such that even if Vivian had received earlier treatment, she would not have survived. In his opinion, Vivian had suffered a severe injury with a predicted mortality of 90% or more based on predictive risk factors. This prognosis was not taking into account the factor of the prolonged cardiac arrest, which likely resulting in ischemic organ and brain injury. Further, Professor Seppelt was satisfied that Vivian received timely and professional medical care. In oral evidence, Matthew Smith indicated that he had seen both Aaron and Vivian's vehicles parked on the property at the time that he located Vivian. Jesse and Michael, however, gave evidence that they did not notice any other vehicle on the property at the time they attended the property. It is possible that Vivian departed the property at some point in an attempt to flee the area, but was forced to return due to the intense fire conditions. And I'll just show now, Your Honour, some photographs of Vivian's property. Your Honour, the pathologist at autopsy concluded that Vivian's cause of death was complications of thermal injuries. It is submitted that this should be recorded as the cause of death because it is broad enough to encapsulate the complications arising from the burn sustained by Vivian on the 8th of November 2019. The manner of Vivian's death was a consequence of the Kangaroo fire overcoming Vivian and her property in White Talaba on the 8th of November 2019. And I'd like to take this opportunity to express those assisting on us gratitude to Vivian's family, in particular her son Aaron, for his involvement in the Coronial investigation and for liaising with members of the team assisting Your Honour. I'd also like to express, on behalf of those assisting Your Honour, our sincere condolences to Vivian's family, including Aaron, Reuben and their father Dennis, and to Vivian's extended family, friends, fellow neighbours, for the loss of Vivian under such tragic circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Castleton.
If it's convenient, I'd like now to address Your Honour in relation to Your Honour's inquest into the death of George Knoll. These are the closing submissions for the inquest into the death of George Knoll. George was 85 years old when he died on the 8th of November 2019. On that day, as Your Honour has heard, the Kangaroo fire, which had previously been contained, swept through the remote community of White Talaba with little warning. The fire impacted numerous properties, including the property where George had lived for 30 years. He was at home at the time of impact. George was found in his car in the driveway of his property the following day on the 9th of November 2019. George's brother, Panagiotis, resides in Greece, and I understand that he may be watching these proceedings. We take this opportunity to acknowledge the devastating circumstances of George's death and the tremendous loss to his family, friends and neighbours and residents of White Talaba. George's home in White Talaba, Your Honour, was surrounded by dense bushland. His house was a 3-room timber frame structure with a corrugated iron roof. It was powered by solar energy and had a backup generator, but was not connected to the mains. Although George had a lengthy medical history and a number of ailments, he was regarded as physically fit and active, notwithstanding his age. George's friend, Philip Hine, attested that at about 2:30 p.m. on 8 November, had learned that there was a fire on the Old Grafton Road through information he had obtained online. Your Honour has heard what I've had to say about the timing of that recollection earlier this morning. At around the time of that information, his neighbour Alan Bacon says that he had returned home, concerned that the fire was approaching his property after sighting a large smoke cloud that appeared to him like a mushroom cloud. When he returned to his property, Alan Bacon received a message from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service to evacuate. At that time, or thereabouts, Mr Hine noticed smoke. He turned on the UHF radio and heard warnings from the White Talaba RFS to evacuate. Mr Hine was ready to defend his home but had decided to leave as the fire was spotting ahead. Mr Hine evacuated to the White Talaba Oval and there spoke with Mr Bacon's partner, who informed him that Mr Bacon had gone up to George's house to assist him. As no emergency alerts were sent until about 4:48 p.m, Mr Hine and Mr Bacon's observations were likely at a much later time. Kim Jeremy, the captain of the White Talaba RFS Brigade, first contacted the Glenelg Fire Control Centre at 3:53 p.m. In oral evidence provided on the 8th of March last year, Mr Bacon stated that he managed to get the spot fires near his home under control and then ran to George's property to assist with putting out spot fires. According to Mr Bacon, he had run back and forth from his house to George's house a number of times. Mr Bacon recalled a conversation that he had with George regarding his intentions with respect to the fire. It was in these terms. He said to George, "What do you want to do?" "You should leave." George said, "No, I'm staying. I want to stay. I'm staying in my own home." I said to George, "You should go." George replied, "This is my home. I'm not going." At the time of that conversation, George was at the back of his home putting out small spot fires with a garden hose. It was then that Mr Bacon noticed his own shed on fire and ran back to put it out, but was unable to as it was simply too big. Mr Bacon then fled to the nearby RFS fire shed about 200 metres from his home, and in doing so ran past George, who appeared to be in his yard with a hose, attempting to put out spot fires. Mr Bacon believed that at that stage the fire front was approximately 20 metres from their homes. Mr Bacon had then yelled out to George, "Get out, George, it's time to go." George, who was about 50 metres away, looked at Mr Bacon but did not respond. Mr Bacon again yelled at him to get out. He then saw George shuffling quickly towards his car, which was parked in his driveway about 5 metres away from where he was standing. Although Mr Bacon did not see Joel enter his car, he assumed that he did. Mr Bacon was aware that Joel kept the keys to his car under the vehicle's seat. Once Mr Bacon had reached the RFS fire shed, he attempted to return to the fire by quad bike and assist George. However, Mr Bacon collided with a four-wheel drive vehicle driven by RFS member Stephen Waddington at the bottom of his driveway. At that time, Mr Bacon was advised by Mr Waddington that he couldn't go further and they needed to leave due to the poor conditions. Mr Bacon was then conveyed to hospital by a New South Wales ambulance to receive treatment for burns he sustained. The last person to see George alive was Mr Bacon. Telephone records indicate that at 4:52 p.m, George phoned an unconfirmed person. That call lasted 27 seconds. This was the last recorded phone call that George made. At this time, that is 4:52 p.m. on the 8th of November, 4 emergency alert voice calls were made to George's phone. The New South Wales police officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Sergeant Damien Loon, was unable to confirm whether George received those messages. At some time between 5:05 and 6:11 p.m, George's house was engulfed by the Kangala fire. It's shown on the RFS line scan now, Your Honour. I just have also shown, Your Honour, photographs that were taken of George's house after the fire passed through. On 9 November 2019, New South Wales Police attended the scene and located the remains of George in his car, which had been parked in the driveway of his home where Mr Bacon had last seen him. Your Honour has received into evidence a volume of material which includes statements from members of the New South Wales Police, civilian witnesses, dental identification report and a call charge record. Oral evidence was also provided to the court on the 8th of March last year by 2 of George's friends and neighbours, as I've mentioned previously, Alan Bacon and Philip Heim. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner holding an inquest concerning the death of a person is required to make findings as to the identity of the person who died, when and where they died, and the manner and cause of death. As Your Honour knows, in addition, Your Honour may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to matters which have the capacity to improve public health and safety in the future arising out of the death in question. In this inquest, George's identity is known, as is the date and place of his death. For this reason, the inquest into Mr Noel's death focused on the manner and cause of death. In the months prior to the fires, George had a conversation, In the months prior to the fires, Mr Bacon had a conversation with George about effective fire preparation, and due to the conditions at the time, they were both involved in preparing their properties by clearing their yards and ensuring they had hoses available and adequate water supply. Mr Hine had a similar conversation with George in the weeks leading up to the fire and had assisted George with inspecting his fire hose to ensure it was in working order. Mr Bacon gave evidence that he was not aware of George's official fire plan, but that on 8 November, when he recommended George should leave as a result of the worsening conditions, George indicated that He wanted to stay and be at his home. He did not want to leave. Mr. Hine also gave evidence that he understood George wanted to stay and protect his house in the event of fire, but that if fire was to get beyond control, evacuation was on George's plan. The evidence indicates that George attempted to flee or seek shelter in his car when the fire reached his property, by which time the fire overwhelmed him as it was just simply too intense. George's brother, Panagiotis, expressed his view that George may not have fully appreciated the scale of the approaching fire, and that in his later years, George's home was his whole world. In these circumstances, George's brother believed that George may have chosen to stay at the property as the fire progressed. An external examination was conducted following George's death, which concluded the direct cause of death as effects of fire. A balance of probability identification was issued following dental examination of the remains against available dental records. The examination confirmed consistencies with each other, resulting in a does not exclude identification. It is therefore submitted, Your Honour, that the cause of George's death should be recorded as the effects of fire on the 8th of November 2019. George died in his car as the Kangaroo fire engulfed him at his property in Waitalaba. As I've said previously, Your Honour, those assisting, Your Honour, express our sincere gratitude to George's brother and his family and friends for their willingness to participate in and assist with the Coronial investigation and for liaising with the members of those assisting, Your Honour. I'd also like, on behalf of those assisting, Your Honour, to express our sincere condolences to George's brother, who lives in Greece, and George's other family members and to his friends, fellow neighbours and the residents of the tight-knit community of Waitalaba for the loss of George under such devastating circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Your Honour, that concludes the closing address in relation to Mr. Knoll. Is it a convenient time, Your Honour, to take the morning adjournment?
Take the morning adjournment and resume at 10 to 12.
Silence, please, all stand. This coroner's court is temporarily Coroners Court review.
Yes, Mr Wilcox.
Yes, Your Honour. These are the closing submissions for the Coronial inquiry into the cause and origin of the fires known as the Badger Forest Fire and the Coondella Fire or Dewar National Park Fire. The Badger Forest Fire encompassed the lands of the Yuin and Narragaow people within the Snowy Monero and Eurobodalla local government areas. The Coondella Fire encompassed the lands of the Yuin people also within Eurobodalla local government area. And the inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act, and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fires in their areas of origin, if able to be established to the satisfaction of Your Honour. On screen now is a map of the Badger area and surrounding fires. The Badger Forest Fire started on 27 December 2019 and burned until 4 March 2020. Its structures were destroyed or damaged, including many homes. Regrettably, 7 people tragically died as a result of the fire: Colin Burns, Robert Solway, Patrick Solway, Richard Steele, John Smith, Ross Rickson and Michael Clark. The Coondella Fire burned for approximately 2 weeks and damaged an area of approximately 2,500 hectares. No structures were destroyed or damaged in connection with this fire, and no lives, fortunately, were lost. It's significant to highlight that the Badger Forest and Coondella fires were 2 of many fires burning across the state of New South Wales during the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season. As Your Honour has heard, not all fires were reported to the coroner. Not all fires reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial cause and origin inquiry continued to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. But the Badger Forest Fire and 6 of the 7 related deaths were the subject of a further general inquiry into fire prediction modelling used by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service in the lead up to and during 30 and 31 December 2019. These submissions are limited to the cause and origin of the Badger Forest and the Coondella fires. The evidence adduced at the inquiry indicates that the Badger Forest Fire originated near the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road in Countegony. The area was used as a logging coupe or dump and was otherwise surrounded by dense forest. The fire ignited from a lightning strike on 27 December 2019. The Badger Forest Fire burned for approximately 10 weeks. 30 December 2019 and the early hours of 31 December 2019 saw particularly fierce fire progression. The fire spread 35 kilometres southeast and down slope. The rate of spread of the fire was extreme and anomalous and was ultimately responsible for 6 out of 7 of the fatalities. Turning to a chronology, on 27 December 2019, a large lightning band spread over the south coast and a storm moved through the area for a period of around 4 hours. The weather conditions on and leading up to this date were hot, with the maximum temperature on 27 December 2019 of 32 degrees. According to the evidence provided by Detective Senior Sergeant Moon, there had been minimal to virtually no rain in the area and heavy winds were recorded. There was also a lot of extremely dry fuel load, which would have been able to be ignited very easily. Photo on screen taken by Jackie Crow. On the evening of 27 December 2019, local residents of Countegony, Jeff Crow and his wife Jackie, observed a fire burning in a logging coupe at the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road. In his statement to New South Wales Police, Mr Crow said, quote, "I would estimate the fire was approximately 1 to 2 hectares in size when I first saw it. I immediately called 000, end quote. The 000 call was answered at 9:33 p.m. and logged by the New South Wales RFS. By 9:40 p.m, the New Morella RFS Brigade, led by Captain Terry Myers, was en route to the area of origin. The brigade made attempts to contain the fire, including water suppression, clearing fire breaks around the fire, and a request for aerial suppression. Between midnight 27 December 2019 and midnight 28 December, according to a fire progression map produced by the RFS, the Badger Forest fire spread through dense forest at a rate of 3 kilometres per hour. There were also further lightning strikes recorded in the vicinity of the Badger Forest fire during this time, which could have ignited further fires. Over the next few days, the Badger Forest fire spread in an easterly direction and was fuelled by strong westerly winds. The fire impacted on many townships, including but not limited to Wadbilliga, Yowrie, Wandella, Calagalite, Dignams Creek, Cobargo and Corma, while heading towards Bermagui. On 30 December 2019, the Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road fires commenced a significant rapid downslope run. By 9:43 p.m. on this date, the fires were mapped as having spread 6 to 10 kilometres downslope to the southeast. The rapid downslope run continued through the night, and by the morning of the 31st of December, as mentioned earlier, the fire had spread 35 kilometres southeast and downslope. Many community members fled their homes in precarious conditions and on short notice. Cobargo RFS Brigade members drove to the area of Yowrie and knocked on the doors of every house to warn residents of the impending fire. Evacuation notices were posted and distributed. In Cobargo, residents were evacuated to the showground. The Corma RFS station was used as an evacuation centre, with about 50 people housed in a station with their pets. RFS crews from Tathra, Bermagui, Cobargo, Gelat and Bega all worked until the early hours of the morning to defend Corma RFS station from burning down. Throughout the night, in various areas, firefighters juggled responding to requests for assistance from the public, attending to spot fires and assessing property. On screen is the fire progression map produced for 31 December 2019. Further, due to the particular ferocity of the fire on this day, Colin Burns, Robert Solway, Patrick Solway, Richard Steele and John Smith tragically lost their lives. Ross Rickson suffered facial burns on that day and subsequently died on 18 January 2020 in hospital. The tragic circumstances surrounding their deaths were addressed in the inquest, or will be addressed in the inquest into their deaths in separate submissions addressing the outcome of those inquests. From 31 December 2019 to the 4th of January 2020, fire progression reports show that the fire slowed. From around 4 January 2020, and due to worsening weather conditions in the Bega Valley, the fire then spread considerably, approximately 12 kilometres to the southeast and then approximately 5 kilometres to the north. In the weeks that followed, the fire continued to burn steadily, but more slowly. Now on screen is a fire progression map for the 23rd of January 2020, the day on which there was severe progression of the fire through Bodella. It was on this day that Michael Clark tragically died at his property. The fire continued to spread around 1 kilometre per day and merged with a number of other fires. It burned until 4 March 2020, a total of 68 days. Evidence as to the cause and origin of the Badger Forest fire was centred around the expert opinions of Detective Senior Sergeant Moon, Ian Cook, fire investigator for the RFS, and Detective Senior Constable Bradley. Detective Senior Sergeant Moon stated in oral evidence that he was directed towards the intersection of the area of Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road as being the potential area of origin by eyewitness information provided by local resident Mr. Crow and the subsequent attendance of the New Morella Fire Brigade to that location. Detective Senior Sergeant Moon conducted a site inspection on 9 January 2020 and stated the fuel loads in the area were altered due to a logging process months earlier. He said there was a large amount of debris from the trees in the harvesting process, much of which was pushed into piles. He further stated that the opposite side of Badger Forest Road and the south side of Turos Falls Road was heavily vegetated with eucalyptus plants and underlying growth. Detective Senior Sergeant Moon confirmed in oral evidence that the weather leading up to the 27th of December 2019 was dry and hot with heavy winds. He referred to information obtained from the Global Position and Tracking Systems Proprietary Limited, or GPATS, which recorded the times of detection and locations of lightning strikes on the afternoon of 27 December 2019 in the area near the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road. Detective Senior Sergeant Moon stated that this area was particularly impacted by lightning activity between 3:30 and 4 p.m. Subsequent to his assessment of the GPATS data, as well as a site and aerial inspection, Detective Senior Sergeant Moon indicated that, in his view, it was probable that the Badger Forest fire was caused by one particular lightning strike at 3:37 p.m. That strike was recorded on GPATS as within 200 metres of the initial fire ground. Mr. Cook confirmed that the fuel loads in the area of origin on 27 December 2019 were extremely high and modified and would therefore have ignited easily. At the site inspection on 9 January 2020, Mr. Cook adopted standard RFS methodology to identify the area of origin. That is, he conducted an examination around the burnt ground in the general area of origin in a counterclockwise direction in a spiral or serpentine pattern. Mr. Cook informed the court that the location of several advancing fire indicators, together with the angle of char and staining, led him to a general area of origin towards the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road. Mr. Cook was unable to identify a specific area of origin. However, he identified a tree or stump that may have been struck by lightning. Mr. Cook informed the court that he excluded other possible causes of the fire, such as campfire, debris burning, smoking or cigarette butts, and power lines. Detective Senior Constable Bradley was unable to conduct a ground or aerial inspection of the site, however relied on eyewitness accounts and investigations carried out by RFS and Detective Senior Sergeant Moon, including in respect of lightning strike data. Detective Senior Constable Bradley confirmed in oral evidence that the likely area of origin of the fire was the intersection area of Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road. He also agreed with Detective Senior Sergeant Moon's and Mr. Cook's hypothesis that the fire likely started by a lightning strike to a tree at around 3:37 p.m. It's therefore submitted that the origin of the Badger Forest fire was near the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road in Cantegany, and the cause of the fire was a lightning strike on 27 December 2019 at approximately 3:37 p.m. In addition to the Badger Forest fire, the inquiry also considered the cause and origin of the Coonella fire in Dewar National Park. The chronology and conclusions as to the Coonella fire's cause and origin is drawn from the evidence that Your Honour received within the Coronial brief of evidence, including RFS lightning strike data mapping, fire progression maps and photographs, as well as the oral evidence of Darren Howell, fire investigator of the RFS. The Coonella fire burned for approximately 2 weeks and damaged an area of approximately 2,500 hectares. No structures were destroyed or damaged in connection with this fire due to its extremely remote location. The fire was first identified by an RFS line scan on 30 December 2019 in the Dewar National Park. This data revealed that the fire first appeared in the vicinity of the Coonella Fire Trail between Serpent Road and Womben Fire Trail. Specifically, Mr. Howell informed the court that the fire's general origin was approximately 800 metres from the intersection of the Coonella Fire Trail and the Womben Fire Trail. He received information from the incident controller at Maruya that the fire was thought to have started on 30 December 2019 at about 1 p.m. and was provided with RFS lightning strike mapping. Mr. Howell said that he, SES crew and police conducted a site inspection on 7 January 2020. The area was in very steep countryside and took the group around 4 hours to get there. The path needed to be cleared with chainsaws. Ropes and harnesses had to be used to get down the escarpment. When the area that was believed to be the area of origin was reached, Mr. Howell stated that he moved from left to right in a serpentine fashion to follow the advancing indicators with the lateral indicators. He said that he then came to an area where the advancing fire indicators stopped and backing indicators commenced. He said that this is called the transition zone, which is where the fire likely started. Mr. Howell also informed Your Honour that his view that the most likely cause of origin was by lightning strike, and identified a particular large tree that appeared to have been struck by lightning. Mr. Howell excluded other causes of fire due to lack of evidence of any competent ignition source in a remote terrain of the general area of origin. It is therefore submitted that the origin of the Coondella fire was in the Dewar National Park, near the intersection of the Coondella and Womben fire trails, and the cause of the fire was a lightning strike to a tree in the days prior to 30 December 2019. Those assisting the court express their gratitude to those who have aided and provided information to Your Honour to assist with the coronial inquiries into the cause and origin of the Badger Forest fire and the Coondella fire. And the council assisting team again express their sincere condolences to the friends and family of those whose lives were claimed by the Badger Forest fire, Colin Burns, Robert Solway, Patrick Solway, Richard Steele, John Smith, Ross Rickson and Michael Clark. Please the court. I'll turn now, Your Honour, to inquests into the death of Colin Burns. These are the closing submissions for the inquest into the death of Colin Burns, who died tragically on the morning of 31 December 2019 at 299 Collagalite Road, Collagalite, from thermal injuries during the Badger Forest fire. On screen now is a picture of Mr. Burns, who was 72 years old when he died. He was found deceased in his burnt-out vehicle on Ballowra Road, Ballowra, after attempting to defend his property from the Badger Forest Road fire. On 31 December 2019, the Badger Forest Road fire took a substantial run of unanticipated proportions, as Your Honour just heard, and swept through the township of Ballowra, impacting properties, including Mr. Burns' bushland property known as Jillaby Farm. On the morning of 31 December 2019, Colin had driven away from his property to escape the fire. He was discovered at 8:25 a.m. on 31 December in his vehicle, approximately 1.5 kilometres from his property. The cause of death was found to be thermal injury. Turning to a chronology, Colin's property, Jillaby Farm, was located on top of a ridge at 3682 Ballowra Road, Ballowra. The 1,500-acre property was difficult to access by road and set in very remote and dense bushland. The property had cattle and included 3 distinct cottages, with one cottage on Woyler Creek and isolated to the west of his other 2 cottages, one in which Colin lived. On 27 December 2019, the Badger Forest Road fire ignited from lightning strike at the intersection of Badger Forest Road and Turos Falls Road in Countegony. Burning in dense forest with extremely high fuel loads, the fire had begun to spread at a rapid speed. On the afternoon of 27 December, Colin left Sydney to drive back to his farm in Ballowra, having spent the Christmas period in Sydney with his partner Threlly. According to Threlly, Colin went back to the farm for a fire drill, as Colin was a long-time member of the Ballowra RFS, and to attend a New Year's party. He left Sydney in his single-cab Nissan Patrol tray-top utility. At 2 a.m. on 27 December, Colin arrived at Jillaby Farm and a local friend was there to meet him. Colin called Threlly to tell her of his safe arrival. On 28 December 2019, Colin remained at the farm and spoke with Threlly over the telephone on 3 occasions. In one conversation, Colin said to Threlly, quote, "The fire is only 15 kilometres away from me," end quote. Threlly replied, quote, oh my God, you better do something, end quote. Colin said, quote, "Oh, don't worry, I'll be okay. All I need is there," end quote. According to Threlly, Colin reassured her that he was preparing himself for fire, having laid out all his water pumps. At 2:30 a.m. on the 28th of December 2019, Colin telephoned Ballowra RFS Captain Ewan Thompson and discussed the Badger fire, which was approaching his property from the west. Both Colin and Mr Thompson were concerned for Colin's property, prompting Mr Thompson to request further resources from the Moruya Fire Control Centre. On 28 or 29 December, Colin telephoned Threlly again and told her that the power was out and that he could only contact her by mobile phone. At approximately 9 a.m. on 30 December 2019, Ewan Thompson, Richard Seeley, Bodella RFS Group Officer, and Ron Trefold, Nerragunda RFS Captain, arrived at Colin's property. The group took Colin with them to inspect the Badger fire front. According to the oral evidence of Mr Thompson, the fire at that stage had not progressed a great deal down the mountain towards Colin's place from what he had seen the previous day. The fire was moving reasonably slowly, but had a very extended front such that its ends could not be seen. In Mr Thompson's view, the fire appeared to have a 2-kilometre frontage. At that point, Colin expressed concern for his property. The RFS groups returned Colin to Jillaby Farm and left to inspect the Churros Falls Road fire front. The RFS later returned to assist Colin to prepare his property from the approaching fire. At that stage, there were 2 RFS tankers, Dalmeny 7 and Ballowra 7, and 5 RFS personnel on Colin's property, clearing rubbish and fuel from around his cottages. RFS member Peter Knight, in his statement to police, said that they sprayed water around the main house and shed and heard, quote, "the fire roaring up the valley towards us," end quote. In addition to assisting Colin with preparing his property, the RFS were also attending to other duties throughout the day. Ewan Thompson informed the court in oral evidence that they were very worried about another fire on the southern end, approximately 22 kilometres away, which appeared to be the biggest threat to the valley. Colin's closest neighbour, Donna Dance, a nearby resident, gave oral evidence that it was about midday on 30 December 2019 when she observed the flashing lights of the fire brigade vehicles behind Colin's home, 5 kilometres from her home. She told Your Honour that at the time the fire was not moving quickly and it was very still with no wind. She saw no movement in the leaves on the trees. At around 1:30 or 2 p.m, the fire impacted Colin's property, destroying the first of his 3 cottages located to the west of his property. Colin remained on his property in an attempt to save his other cottages from the fire. From about 2 p.m, spot fires were evident approximately 4 kilometres from Colin's 2 remaining cottages. Local RFS brigades were unable to access them due to the topography of the property. According to Ewan Thompson, the fire was expanding, but not at a rapid rate at that stage. At approximately 3 to 4 p.m, Ewan Thompson was attempting to help Colin to get his pump working on his trailer with no success. At 6 p.m, Threlly telephoned Colin. In that conversation, Colin stated, quote, "You ring me at the wrong time. Can you follow up with Dame Nellie to see where they are?" end quote. Threlly said, quote, okay, I'll follow up now, end quote. This, tragically, was the last time Threlly spoke with Colin. Threlly telephoned Dame Nellie to convey that Colin was waiting for him at the farm. Dame Nellie said, quote, "I'm sorry, all the roads are closed and diverting them to the shelter," end quote, and people were not permitted to pass through. At 6:10 p.m, Threlly again telephoned Colin a number of times, but he was not answering. At approximately 8 p.m, Ewan Thompson sent his RFS crew, comprising Richard Seeley, Peter Knight, and the crew of Dalmeny 7, back to the Ballowra fire shed to have a rest, as the fire at that stage appeared to slow down and was heading in a more southerly direction. According to his oral evidence, Mr. Thompson stayed up with Colin to monitor the fire throughout the night with another member of the brigade, Trevor Kincaid, who had made his own way to Colin's place just after dark. In the early hours of 31 December 2019, the weather had changed. In oral evidence, Deborah Dance said that at midnight, the fire seemed to appear very dangerous at the western end of the valley and was now quite dangerous looking along the southern region in a place referred to as Spring Mountains. She told the court that the fire had crowned the mountain and was starting to come down the other side. Quote, "That was when I realised that it was up the top of the mountain," end quote. By 1 a.m, quote, "a very, very fierce northwesterly wind started and came through," end quote. At approximately 2:30 a.m, Ewan Thompson received a call from Richley Sealy, who told him that his crew in Dalmeny 7 had been called to Nerrigunda. According to the statement in evidence from Richie Sealy, it was at 3 a.m. that he saw Colin sitting on his porch. At that time, Richie said to Colin, quote, "I'm going out on patrol and have a look at the fire for you," end quote. Colin wanted the tankers back at his place. Richie said, quote, "We are now working on saving lives and not property. I advise that you get out and go to the fire station," end quote. Colin told him that he wanted to stay and defend his property. Richie said, quote, "We will try and patrol it and try to get back," end quote. There is a discrepancy in the evidence concerning the time Trevor Kincaid left Colin's property, though little turns on this. The evidence is that Trevor left to return to Ballara Fire Station so that he could protect his own property somewhere between the hours of 2:30 a.m. and 4 a.m. Ewan Thompson informed the court that after Dalmeny 7 tanker and Trevor left, he remained for a further 30 to 40 minutes to wind up the fire hose lines that had been laid out to defend Colin's property. He then drove in the Ballara 7 tanker to observe how far away the fire was. Mr. Thompson's assessment was that the fire had changed direction. He told Your Honour, quote, "It was a very warm northwester blowing and the fire was sweeping more to the south and had slowed down in a direction towards Colin's buildings," end quote. At around 4 a.m. or 5 a.m, Deborah Dance observed that the fire on the southern side of the valley on the Spring Mountain was blowing back on itself. At about 5 to 5:30 a.m, Mr. Thompson had awoken Colin, who had been sleeping. Mr. Thompson told Your Honour that at that stage he was very concerned that the fire appeared to be a bigger threat to the southern or middle section of Ballara Valley, and so made the decision to leave Colin, as more people were going to be at risk on the southern end of the valley. Mr. Thompson and Colin had a brief conversation about a fire plan prior to Mr. Thompson leaving. There is no evidence of any person having contact with Colin after Mr. Thompson left Colin's property on the morning of 31 December 2019. Ewan Thompson headed to Ballara Fire Station in a Ballara 7 tanker, where he picked up crew member Peter Knight before attending to another property nearby. While defending that property, Ewan Thompson received a call on UHF radio to return to the fire shed as it was expected to come under threat. In response, Ewan Thompson called the Dalmeny 7 crew to take over at the property that they had been protecting. After arriving at the fire shed, Mr. Thompson received a call from Richard Sealy, who informed them of another house under threat on the southern end of the valley. The fire shed at that time was not under immediate threat. Mr. Thompson requested the Dalmeny 7 tanker return to the fire shed to protect those who had gathered there. Mr. Thompson informed the court that there were a lot of people at the fire shed who had sought safety after evacuating their properties. Ewan Thompson and Peter Knight continued to work throughout the night defending properties. At about 7:25 a.m, Deborah Dance noticed spot fires starting along the western side of her house. She left the property with her family to inspect her second property. They travelled along Ballara Road to the west. At about 8:20 a.m, before they reached the front gate to their second property, they encountered a burnt-out vehicle by the side of Ballara Road, approximately 1.5 kilometres from Colin's property. The vehicle had a trailer hitched to the back, which had flipped over. Deborah and her husband, Keith, recognised the vehicle as belonging to Colin. Keith approached the vehicle and saw a deceased body inside. At midday, Ewan Thompson returned to the Ballara fire station. There he approached Deborah and Keith Dance and inquired about Colin. They told him that they found Colin's burnt vehicle and the road was still too dangerous to travel on, owing to fallen trees. Deborah and Keith Dance informed police and the local RFS members of their discovery. On the afternoon of 31 December, Senior Constable Peter Gillette was asked to commence an investigation into the whereabouts of Colin. He was aware of the report of the burnt-out vehicle. Due to the fire activity, there was widespread radio, electricity and mobile phone outages, and the conditions precluded search and rescue for 24 to 48 hours. On 1 January 2020, Ewan Thompson and another RFS member drove back to Colin's property and located his burnt-out vehicle with the upturned trailer, which is now displayed on screen. They cordoned off the area, and then on the 2nd of January, Detective Senior Constable Gillette and Detective Technical Inspector Sasha Debden from Wollongong Crime Scene Forensic Evidence Technical Services Command undertook examination of the scene, and the burnt-out single-cab Nissan Patrol tray-top ute, later confirmed to be owned by Colin. The ute faced in an easterly direction on Ballara Road, Ballara. It was positioned against the cutting, with the attached trailer tipped on its side. The trailer had been manufactured for use in firefighting, with a capacity to carry a 1,000 litre water cube, pump, hoses and associated equipment. On the 10th of January 2020, forensic pathologist Bernard Lons performed an autopsy. On 20 January 2020, a DNA identification report positively identified the remains located within the vehicle as those of Colin Burns. Identification was confirmed by comparing samples from the remains located and those from swabs from personal effects of Mr. Burns. The official cause of death on the autopsy report, authored by Bernard Lons on 18 February 2020, was thermal injury. The court received into evidence a volume of material comprising 242 pages, including a statement from Mr. Burns' partner, Estrelita or Threlly Kabakungan, statements from civilian witness Deborah Dance, statements from RFS personnel and members of the New South Wales Police Force. It also includes a report from the DNA laboratory of the New South Wales Health, Pathology, Forensic and Analytical Science Services here in Lidcombe. The court also received into evidence a further volume comprising photographs and videos for the far southern region of fires, as well as a general brief relating more broadly to the southern region of New South Wales. The officer in charge, Gwen Bradley, gave oral evidence on 6 September 2021 in respect of the Badger Forest fire and all related deaths. Colin's neighbour Deborah Dance and Captain of Ballara RFS Brigade Ewan Thompson gave oral evidence on 7 September 2021. Mr. Burns' partner, Threlly Kabakungan, also provided a family statement. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner holding an inquest concerning the death of a person who was required to make findings as to the identity of the person who died, when and where they died, and what was the cause and manner of that person's death. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to matters which have the capacity to improve public health and safety in the future, arising out of the death in question. In this inquest, Colin's identity is known, as is the date and place of his death. For this reason, the inquest into Colin's death focused on the cause and manner of his death. Evidence as to the circumstances of Colin's death centred around the oral evidence of Ballara Fire Captain Ewan Thompson and neighbour Deborah Dance and the police. The evidence before Your Honour indicated that Colin made a decision to stay at his Jillaby Farm property for as long as he could in order to protect it from the approaching Badger Road fire. He then drove in an easterly direction away from his property before the fire reached him on Bodella Road, approximately 1.5 kilometres from his home. In oral evidence and in his statement, Ewan Thompson told the court of his conversations with Colin at the time of the fires. He recalled that after Colin lost his first cottage to the fire, he expressed an intention to stay on the property to defend the remaining cottages, and that he, quote, insisted that he would stay there, end quote. Mr. Thompson also recalled that before he left Colin's property at about 5 a.m. on 31 December 2019, the following conversation took place. Mr. Thompson, if your life is threatened, leave and go to the fire shed. Colin did not verbally reply but nodded in agreement. Mr. Thompson, I don't think I'll be able to get back to assist you if your house comes under threat later. Colin again nodded and was provided an RFS radio to maintain contact if need be. According to the evidence before Your Honour, this was the last conversation Colin had with respect to any fire plan. Colin was determined to remain on his property to save it from the fire. In Mr. Thompson's statement about his last conversation with Colin, he expressed the view, quote, having known Colin as a very strong person, I knew that he would not leave his property until the absolute last minute, end quote. Trevor Kincaid, who knew Colin since the 1970s, expressed a similar view in his statement to police, quote, I knew Colin to be a very strong-willed person and one who was very hard to be dissuaded once he had made up his mind on the subject, end quote. Colin's partner Trelly indicated in her statement to police, quote, he is sometimes stubborn and wants things his way. He would have wanted to protect his farm, end quote. Colin's closest neighbour, Deborah Dance, described in oral evidence and in her statement to police that the Badger Forest Road fire that swept through Ballara destroyed their 2 houses, shed and fencing on the evening of 31 December 2019. She described that the fire, quote, moved with frightening ferocity and intensity, spitting fireballs in its path, end quote. Deborah estimated that spot fires had descended on her property, which neighboured Colin's property, at about 7:25 a.m. Ultimately, the overnight conditions were significantly different than that anticipated. During the court's general inquiry into fire prediction, David Philp gave evidence that the sheer spread of the fire was a consequence of long-distance spotting as the fire moved down the valley. That could entail spotting 30 kilometres ahead and beyond downwind. Dr. Marsden Smedley agreed this was a plausible explanation. Spotting at such distances was beyond the comprehension of any of the models used by the RFS during the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season. Detective Senior Constable Peter Gillette conducted an examination of the scene where Colin's vehicle was located and provided a statement in which he expressed his opinion that the vehicle was being driven in the early hours of 31 December 2019 and it was likely that visibility would have been greatly diminished by thick smoke, embers and fire. He believes that the vehicle failed to negotiate a right-hand bend, with the trailer impacting with the cutting, causing it to overturn onto its right-hand side. This capsizing of the trailer caused the vehicle to become disabled. He formed this opinion based on the physical evidence of skid and gouge marks, which were consistent with the collision occurring between the trailer and the cutting. He was unable to conclude as to whether Colin got out of the vehicle prior to seeking shelter within it. In relation to the location of the fire hose and pumps located on the ground, Detective Senior Constable Peter Gillette believed that they may have fallen from the back of the trailer as it overturned. There is no evidence to suggest that there was any attempt made to use the hoses as they were rolled up and not connected to the fire pump. Detective Senior Constable Gillette is of the view that due to the horrendous fire conditions, Colin may have been driving erratically and panicked whilst attempting to drive through fire and smoke. He suggested that Colin had taken immediate action on the warnings he was given to seek shelter at the fire shed. If he had, he would likely have survived the Badger Forest Road fire. According to the statement in evidence of Detective Inspector Sasha Debnan, who examined the vehicle and scene, it was likely that Colin had attempted to negotiate a sweeping right-hand curve on a downward camber on a narrow, unsealed road. As a result of this manoeuvre, the trailer ended up on its offside. Detective Inspector Dedman proffered two reasons that may have caused this to occur. Firstly, the trailer swinging wide on the curve, clipping the cutting, causing an impact mark, and then rolling over with the vehicle continuing a short distance before coming to rest. Or secondly, the trailer rolling due to centrifugal forces and either the vehicle or trailer impacting the cutting, causing an impact mark before coming to rest. In submission of those assisting, Your Honour, noting the above, it's respectfully submitted that no recommendations are warranted. Turning to manner and cause of death, the pathologist at autopsy concluded that Mr. Burns' cause of death was thermal injury. Accordingly, in our submission, Your Honour would make the following findings under Section 81, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act: that Colin Burns died in his vehicle on the morning of 31 December 2019 at Ballara Road, Ballara, New South Wales. The cause of death was thermal injury after his car was disabled while driving east trying to escape the Badger Forest fire. Image on screen of Colin. Those assisting, Your Honour, express their gratitude to Colin's partner Threlly and Brian Snape, Colin's brother-in-law, for their involvement and willingness to participate in and assist with the coronial investigation into the tragic death of Colin. The council assisting team again expressed their sincere condolences to Threlly and Colin's family, neighbours, RFS colleagues and friends for his loss under such devastating circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox.
Your Honour, I'll move on to the inquest into the death of John Smith. These are the closing submissions for the inquest into the death of John Smith, who tragically died on 31 December 2019 at Lot 9, Murphy's Ridge Road in Nerrigunda, New South Wales, from thermal injuries during the Badger Forest fire. On screen is an image of John and Emerald. John was 71 when he died on the morning of 31 December 2019 at his property in Nerrigunda after attempting to flee the Badger Forest Road fire by car and subsequently on foot. On 31 December 2019, as Your Honour has heard, the Badger Road forest fire took a substantial run of unanticipated proportions and swept through the township of Nerrigunda, impacting properties, including John's rural property. John was at his property at the time of the fire. His remains were discovered on 5 January 2020 in close proximity to his burnt-out vehicle, which was located on Murphy's Ridge Road, Nerrigunda. The cause of death was thermal injuries. Turning to a chronology, John and his wife Josie lived in Catalina with their daughter Emerald. John also owned a 200-acre bush property located at 9 Murphy's Ridge Road, Nerrigunda. There were two structures on the remote property, a house and a shed, which John used as a home to live in. The property was located near the Turos River, which ran parallel and curved around the property at a distance of about 1 to 2 kilometres. The driveway to the house started approximately 4 kilometres from Ballara Road down a winding access route from Murphy's Bridge Road. On the afternoon of 30 December 2019, John was with Josie in Catalina. They were made aware of the Badger Forest Road fire, and John made the decision to drive to his property alone and prepare it for the likely fire. On arrival, John cleaned the roof and removed valuable tools. At around 9 p.m, John called Josie on her mobile. He told her he was on top of the roof in an attempt to get mobile reception. He asked Josie to check the Fires Near Me app. Josie informed John that the fire was at a watch and act level, and she asked him to return home due to the proximity of the fire. In her statement, she said, quote, "I begged him to come back down to Catalina as I was worried for him," end quote. John promised Josie that he would be back as soon as he could. During that phone conversation, John told Josie that he could see red smoke from the roof of the house. However, the wind at that stage was blowing in the opposite direction. John told Josie he would call her in the morning. That tragically was the last known contact John had with any person. It is not known what John's movements were from that point onwards throughout the night and early morning of 31 December 2019. At around 6 to 8 a.m. on the following morning of 31 December, the Badger Forest Road fire impacted the Nerrigunza area, including John's property. Image is now displayed of John's property, which was destroyed by the fire. It's not clear from the evidence at precisely what time the fire impacted John's property or in what circumstances John drove away from the area. Josie gave evidence by way of statement about her attempts to contact John. Quote, "At 5 in the morning, I was shocked to see the fires near Meap when the fire at Badger had already connected with Wandella and already crossed the Prince's Highway. I rang John, but it was went to his voicemail. I panicked and rang him again and again, even though I knew that the phone reception in the bush is very poor. Then my home line rang, and it was an emergency service telling us to act because the fire from Mogo was heading towards Bateman's Bay. I didn't know what to do. We had a fire plan at our house. I prepared drums of water around the house and long hoses connected to the taps, but our plan was for me to go take my daughter to the evacuation centre while John would fight the fire. But John wasn't there. I was so scared for him at that moment while panicking about what to do for our house in town. I woke up my 10-year-old daughter, put food in the car and more stuff that we might need while in the evacuation centre. It was a very hot morning," end quote. Josie's shock reflected the sheer unexpected spread of the fire on the evening of 30 December 2019 and the early hours of the following morning. Ultimately, overnight conditions were significantly different from that anticipated. During Your Honour's general inquiry into fire prediction, David Philp gave evidence that the sheer spread of the fire was a consequence of long-distance spotting as the fire moved down the valley. This could entail spotting 30 kilometres and beyond downwind, which Dr. Marsden Smedley agreed was a plausible explanation. As Your Honour has heard, spotting at such distances was beyond the comprehension of any of the models used by the RFS during the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season. About 7:55 a.m, Josie telephoned John's best friend, Murray Kerr, as he had informed her that he would go to John's house in the morning on his way back home to Catalina. Murray checked in at John's property but did not find him there. At around 8 a.m. that morning, Josie left her Catalina house to evacuate to the Hanging Rock Evacuation Centre. Josie called 000 a number of times throughout the day but could not get through to emergency services. On 1 January 2020, no word was received from John. Josie continued to contact 000 throughout the day to report that John was in the bush and she had not heard from him. Josie had also contacted friends and asked for help to locate John. On 2 January 2020, Josie spoke with John's friend Darren Nelson. He informed her that he would attempt to get to John's property the following day when he would likely be able to gain access to the area. About 4 January 2020, John's two friends Darren Nelson and Kurt Rogan drove to John's property to look for him. They located John's car, a Subaru Forester, burnt on the side of Murphy's Ridge Road. However, there was no sign of John in his car. The following day, 5 January 2020, local RFS members, New South Wales Police and a number of John's friends searched for John. The Australian Defence Force had also undertaken a search by helicopter. The following morning, 6 January 2020, Kurt continued his efforts to search for John and tragically at approximately 7 a.m. discovered remains that he believed to be of John. The remains were found approximately 50 metres from the burnt-out car and approximately 500 metres from the main house on the property. Investigating police attended the scene and inspected the vehicle, which was positioned against a tree with damage consistent with a heavy impact. DNA forensic analysis was conducted on 20 January 2020, with the remains positively confirmed on balance of probabilities to be those of John. In her statement, Josie described the aftermath of the fire at the property. Quote, "I went to the property after John's funeral service on 3 February 2020 and saw the devastation the fire had left. It was like in an apocalyptic world. The bush that was once so thick and green was so bare, brown, with black trees standing. When I saw the burnt out car, it was a less than a 1-year-old Subaru Forester, but it looks like a skeleton car. When we went to the shed, which I used as my art studio before, I could see only shattered glasses and corrugated iron roof everywhere. Some of the corrugated iron was already hanging on the top of the huge tree. When I looked at the house, it was crumbled and totally destroyed. But the little tool shed where tools were kept, and was one of the reasons John had to stay that night because he wanted to move some tools from the tool shed for safety, was still standing. End quote. The court has received into evidence a volume of material comprising 290 pages, including statements from John's wife, Josie, statements from civilian witnesses, members of the police force, telephone records, and an expert report from the New South Wales Forensic and Analytical Science Service in Lidcombe. The court received into evidence a further volume comprising photographs and videos for the far southern region of fires, including photographs from Lot 9, Murphy's Ridge Road, as well as a general brief relating more broadly to the southern region fires in New South Wales. The officer in charge, Glenn Bradley, gave oral evidence on 6 September 2021 in respect to the Badger Forest fire and all related deaths. Your Honour also heard from Kurt Rogan, a friend of John's, on 9 September 2021. John's wife, Josie, also provided a family statement following the close of evidence for the benefit of the court. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner holding an inquest concerning the death of a person is required to make findings as to the identity of the person who died, when and where they died, what was the cause of the manner of that person's death. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to matters which have the capacity to improve public health and safety in the future arising out of the death in question. In this inquest, John's identity is known, as is the date and place of his death. For this reason, the inquest into John's death focused on cause and manner of death. In oral evidence, Kurt Rogan described his efforts to locate John on 4 January 2020 with Darren Nelson. They walked the 4-kilometre distance from Murphy's Bridge Road to get to John's property. They were unable to drive as the road had been covered with fallen trees. As they walked along the road, they located what Darren believed to be John's burnt-out vehicle, situated off the side of the road, approximately 400 metres from his house. They did not see John in the car, and so continued to conduct a search around Turos River, believing that John may have sought to retreat there. Kurt gave evidence about the state of the vehicle they located. He observed it was facing in a direction towards John's property and house rather than away from it. It was approximately 10 metres off the roadway, slightly down an embankment. The car had hit a large tree. Kurt indicated that he saw major front-end damage to the vehicle, and it was a shell of a car with hardly anything remaining of the vehicle. The rims had melted and the aluminium rocket cover had liquefied. On the same day, Kurt and Darren also located a mobile phone and a pair of reading glasses still in their case on the road itself and in close proximity to the vehicle. Kurt believed that John may have dropped them at some point. The following day, 6 January 2020, Kurt again attended John's property, this time with another friend of John's, Murray Kerr. On that occasion, Kurt located the remains of John near a gully about 40 to 50 metres from where he'd earlier located the mobile phone and glasses. An explanation proffered by Kurt as to why John's remains were on the opposite side of the road as that of the vehicle, which was on the riverside, was that John may have been completely disoriented by smoke and thought it was the quickest place to get out and get cover. As to why the vehicle was facing John's house and not away from the house, Kurt speculated that John may have attempted to make a run for it and, realising that he could not get out, turned back to get to his house and in doing so ran off the road due to poor visibility from smoke or flames. Kurt stated that he returned to the scene on 6 January 2020 with police and directed them to where he located the remains of John. Police Forensic Evidence and Technical Services Officer Detective Inspector Debnam and Senior Constable Alex McAvoy noted that a burnt-out Subaru station wagon was positioned against a tree with apparent damage consistent with a heavy impact. Also noted were tyre marks leading from the western edge of the roadway to the resting point of the vehicle, suggesting that the vehicle was travelling in a generally southerly direction, lost traction and then slid laterally before colliding with a tree. In an extended search of the area, New South Wales Police found 3 sets of vehicles between the vehicle and remains of John, suggesting that they were dropped by John as he sought shelter from the fire in the gully. On 20 January 2020, a forensic comparison between human remains located at 9 Murphy's Ridge Road, Nerrigunda, and the personal effects of John, namely a toothbrush, was conducted by the New South Wales Forensic and Analytical Science Service in Lidcombe. It was determined that the human remains were those of John Robert Smith. Following an autopsy performed by forensic pathologist Bernard Lons, the cause of death was determined as thermal injury. On that basis, it submitted that John's cause of death was thermal injury resulting from the Badger Road forest fire. Accordingly, in our submission, Your Honour, would make the following findings under Section 81 of the Coroners Act: that John Smith died on 31 December 2019 near Lot 9, Murphy's Ridge Road in Nerrigunda, New South Wales, from thermal injuries while attempting to flee the Badger forest fire. Finally, image on screen, Your Honour, of John, Josie and Emerald. Those assisting express their gratitude to John's family, in particular his wife Josie, for her involvement in the Coronial investigation and for liaising with members of the team assisting, Your Honour. The council assisting team again expressed their sincere condolences to the Smith family, including Josie, daughter Emerald, and sons Sam, David, Raphael and his mother Maya for their loss.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox.
Does Your Honour wish for me to continue, or I think that's enough time.
Yes.
And Your Honour, I'll turn to the inquest into the death of Richard Steele. These are the closing submissions for the inquest into the death of Richard Steele, who tragically died on the morning of 31 December 2019 at 299 Calagalite Road, Calagalite, New South Wales, from thermal injuries during the Badger Forest fire. Picture on screen there of Richard Steele, known to all as Rick. He was 56 years old when he died on the morning of 31 December 2019 after the Badger Road forest fire impacted his rural property at Calagalite. The Badger Road forest fire, contrary to earlier predictions, swept through the township of Calagalite during an unprecedented run on 31 December 2019, impacting properties including the property where Rick lived for 2 years and 9 months. Rick had remained at his property at the time of the fire. His remains were discovered on 1 January 2020 in a granny flat of the property in which he resided. The cause of death was thermal injuries. Turning to a chronology, Rick lived at 299 Calagalite Road, Calagalite, on a 20-acre property owned by his friend Ernest Berger. Ernest, or Ernie, lived in the main house on the property, while Rick lived in a granny flat which comprised 4 bedrooms, a living area, kitchen, bedroom and bathroom. The granny flat was located approximately 110 metres south of the main residence. No other person resided at the property. The property on which they lived was triangular in shape and ran approximately 500 metres along Calagalite Road. The property was surrounded by the Biamgara National Park, and a dam was situated at the front of the property to the west, encircled by a number of trees. The west and east boundaries of the property were also lined with trees. The remaining areas of the property consisted of grass. Rick was an avid grower of orchids and various ferns, including elk horns, which he grew in various sheds on the property. Both Rick and Ernie shared a passion for plants. In the days leading up to the fire, Rick and Ernie were at home in their respective parts of the property. Rick told Ernie that he was tracking the fires on the Bureau of Meteorology website. On 30 December 2019, the day before the Badger Forest Road fire impacted the property, Rick and Ernie tracked the fire to, at its nearest, Dignams Creek, approximately 7 to 8 kilometres away, in the Coronal National Park. At that time, Ernie and Rick were concerned about the fire impacting the property. At about 9:30 p.m, Ernie again checked the Bureau of Meteorology website and noticed that the fire, which was near Dignam's Creek, had not moved. At 4:40 a.m. on the morning of 31 December 2019, Ernie was woken up by his landline but could only hear interference followed by silence. The phone went dead. Ernie then noticed a large amount of activity across the valley with vehicles headed towards Bermagui Road and a glow on the horizon. Ernie again checked the Bureau of Meteorology website and could see that the fire had since travelled and appeared to be impacting a large part of Cobargo and surrounding areas. The fire looked to be travelling in a southeasterly direction. With that information, Ernie walked back to the back of Rick's place and yelled, quote, "Rick, shit's happening, check your phone," end quote. Mr. Steele awoke and said that he would meet Ernie down at his house on the property. Rick arrived at Ernie's house within 5 minutes of that conversation and informed Ernie that he had received alerts on his mobile phone from the RFS. The first of the two RFS alert messages read, quote, "Corma residents advised to evacuate to Bermagui," end quote. The second message read, quote, "Cobargo residents advised to evacuate to Bermagui," end quote. Corma is approximately 10 kilometres southwest of the property and Cobargo approximately 6 kilometres northwest. Ernie and Rick then walked down the driveway together and observed a red glow, which they believed was fire to the northwest. They could see the fire in the national park and about 3 kilometres away and could see a grass fire to the north along the Cobargo-Bermagui Road. The fire was travelling in an easterly direction and appeared to be moving fairly slowly. At around 5 a.m. on 31 December 2019, both Rick and Ernie discussed the fire and agreed on their fire plan. The plan was to stay at the property and use a pump to bring water from the dam. In the event that power was lost, they agreed to leave immediately. The power failed at about 5:15 a.m. and Rick and Ernie went to their respective homes to pack. Each had their own car parked on the property. During the short period between the time the power was cut and when Rick was packing, conditions changed considerably. The wind changed from a breeze to a strong westerly gust, and the temperature was very hot for the early morning. As the wind changed, Ernie could see and hear the fire coming from Cobargo to the northwest. He could hear cracking, and within minutes, an amber storm flew towards the property. At this time, the fire front had reached, and spot fires began igniting around the property. Within a very short period of time, Ernie's main house caught fire, and he witnessed huge branches hurtling through the air. He observed that it was dark from the smoke with visibility at about 1 metre. Rick and Ernie decided they would leave, each in their own car. As Ernie got in his car and drove away, he soon realised that Rick was not following behind in his own vehicle. Concerned about Rick, Ernie returned to the property but was unable to reach Rick's granny flat. His own house was well alight at that stage. Ernie attempted to look for Rick, but he could not see anything past his house due to the flames. Ernie waited until the fire passed and made his way to Rick's granny flat. He saw that parts of the flat were on fire and the roof had collapsed. The brick walls were still standing, however the rest of the building was destroyed. Rick's car remained parked and was also on fire. It was at that point that Ernie realised that Rick had not left and was most likely in the granny flat. According to Ernie, the devastation of the fire, quote, happened within minutes, end quote. Mobile phone records of Rick were later examined by New South Wales Police, revealing that last known contact by Rick was made with his sister, Martine Jordan. According to Martine, she sent a text message to Rick at 5:45 a.m. on 31 December 2019, which read, quote, "Hey big brother, are you anywhere near these disgusting fires? We're still at Borley Point, not leaving till next week. All good here. Most of the area around us is burnt already. Can you send me your address so I know where you are?" End quote. At 5:45, Rick replied to that message stating, quote, My address is 299 Coagulite Road, Coagulite 2550. Seems the south got lit yesterday. Just received message to head to Bermagui and evacuate. Enormous amounts of activity on farms right now as they are moving their stock. Can see flames in distance. Today will be interesting. We will keep you informed. End quote. At 5:58, Martine sent an immediate reply. That message read, I had a feeling during the night you were close. What are your plans? Please keep me updated. End quote. Martine sent 3 further messages to Rick's mobile, however no response was received. The following day, around 10:30 a.m. on 1 January 2020, the RFS attended the property, which is now displayed on screen, and located Rick's remains inside the granny flat. The court received into evidence a volume of material comprising 258 pages, including a statement from Mr. Steele's sister, Martine Jordan, statements from civilian witnesses, statements from members of the police, RFS, and telephone and medical records. The volume of evidence also included an expert certificate from the New South Wales Forensic and Analytical Science Services. Your Honour received into evidence a further volume comprising photographs and videos for the far southern region of fires, including photographs from 299 Coagulite Road, as well as a general brief relating more broadly to the southern region fires. The officer in charge, Glenn Bradley, gave oral evidence on 6 September 2021 in respect to the Badger Forest fire and all related deaths, and Your Honour also heard from Ernie Berger, owner of Rick's residence, on 9 September 2021. Rick's sister, Martine Jordan, also provided a family statement following the close of evidence for the benefit of the court. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner holding an inquest concerning the death of a person is required to make findings as to the identity of the person who died, when and where they died, and what was the cause and manner of their death. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to matters which have the capacity to improve public health and safety in the future arising out of the death in question. In this inquest, Rick's identity is known, as is the date and place of his death. For this reason, the inquest focused on Rick's cause and manner of death. According to the officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Constable Glenn Bradley, Rick had sent his last text message to Martine after he had separated from Ernie at the main house in order to go and pack his bag and evacuate. No evidence exists as to whether Rick attempted to evacuate or whether he changed his mind and decided to stay on the property to protect it. In oral evidence, Ernie recalled a conversation with Rick where they discussed their fire plan. Ernie said to Rick that if they have no power, then they will have no water, and if the wind changed, they would have to pack their bags and leave. At that stage, Rick contemplated staying and fighting the fire as he thought that it would only be a grass fire. Ernie stated that the wind was going in the right direction at that time, and they initially perceived no danger from the fire. Ernie gave evidence that it was a little after 5 o'clock when the power went out, and they both decided to pack their bags and leave the property. Ernie stated that at about 30 minutes after the power went, as he was packing the car, the wind changed from an easterly breeze to almost gale force winds from the west, blowing straight from behind the fire. As he closed the door of his car, the wind hit him in the face, and the fire was only 500 metres away down the gully in front of the property. By the time he turned his car around, his driveway was consumed by fire. Only 60 seconds had passed from Ernie feeling safe. Those conditions were not anticipated by the RFS. During the court's general inquiry into fire prediction, David Philp gave evidence that the sheer spread of the fire was a consequence of long-distance spotting. That could entail spotting of 30 kilometres and beyond downwind. Dr. Marsden Smedley agreed this was a plausible explanation. Spotting at such distances was beyond the comprehension of any of the fire prediction models used by the RFS during the 2019-2020 bushfire season. At the time that Ernie left his property, he assumed Rick was packing his own belongings, ready to leave. Ernie stated that he left the property and tried to get to Coagulite Road, but could not progress far due to flames and a large fallen tree blocking the road. At that point, he did not know where Rick was. Concerned for Rick's safety, Ernie turned his vehicle back towards his property and observed that Rick's car was still there. Ernie then changed a flat tyre on his car, which had been burnt by the fire, and made his way back to the main road, where he approached the RFS, informed them that Rick was back at the property. The RFS informed Ernie that it was too safe to enter as the buildings were still smouldering. On 5 February 2020, a forensic comparison between human remains located at the granny flat at 299 Coagulite Road, Coagulite, and the personal effects of Rick, a toothbrush, were conducted by New South Wales Forensic and Analytical Science Service in Lincoln. It was determined that the human remains were Rick's. Following an autopsy performed by the forensic pathologist Bernard Lons on 14 January 2020, the cause of death was determined as thermal injury. On this basis, it is submitted that Rick's cause of death is thermal injury resulting from the Badger Road forest fire. Accordingly, in our submission, Your Honour would make the following findings under Section 81 of the Coroners Act: that Richard Steele died on the morning of 31 December 2019 at 299 Coagulite Road, Coagulite, New South Wales, from thermal injuries as a result as the Badger forest fire overwhelmed his home. The final image of Rick on screen. Those assisting express their gratitude to Rick's family and friends, and particularly his sister Martine, for her involvement in the Coronial investigation and for liaising with the team, members of the team assisting Your Honour. And the council assisting team again expressed their sincere condolences to Martine Jordan and Rick's friends for their loss. Please decline.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. I think that concludes
matters for today, Your Honour.
Yes, so we'll adjourn till 10:30.
10 a.m. tomorrow.
10 a.m. tomorrow.